the political milieu, who had been a general in the war, who had had a different orientation. This time, America wanted to step outside and choose someone who had a business experience. And of course, Trump's entire career has been running his own company. So if you want to understand Donald Trump, the best way to understand him is actually to ask the question, how did he run his country? How did he run his company? Because that's the same way he will be running the United States. And the second question then is, what is Trump's worldview? What does Trump actually believe? Now there is, of course, a lot of media opinion about these things. And the media is not Trump's favorite category, to say the least. But I think you could understand him from his principles, from the voiceless people, the forgotten Americans who he's trying to represent, and in his notion of government, which is really to try to limit government and also to, I would say, either delimit or to derail what we call the administrative state. So we're going to have an era now, at least for the next 4 years, some of us think for the next 8 years, a period where there'll be great deregulation across American society and in the administration of things, particularly as it has to do with government. He's also a candidate, and I think it would be interesting to maybe touch on this here for a few minutes, who has an idea of returning America to its former position of greatness. So you know, of course, his theme. But that also has to do with a kind of spiritual centeredness. Now, sometimes when I talk about Donald Trump and spirituality, I get a great surprise. But you might know that this last week, his wife, Melania, gave an introduction to her husband for the first time, and she used the Lord's Prayer to introduce him. Very significant, I think, because even in the choice of people he's bringing into his cabinet or the kind of selection he's making in the Supreme Court, he's trying to find people who have a principled background, and many of them actually come from an evangelical faith. So when you look at the election the analysis of the election, which of course everyone is doing because no one expected him to be president, at least no one in the media, none of the pollsters, none of the experts. So in some ways it's a big surprise. 89% of all of America's evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. He is their president. He is largely in office because of the evangelical community who don't live on the East Coast or the West Coast, but live in that middle part of America. And I think he's there to represent their values and their opinions. Of course, he also ran a very, very brutal election. I don't know if you followed it from Europe or you're still following it. He ran against 17 different candidates, all of whom were established Republican figures in the primary. And one by one, he knocked them off. And then, of course, in the general election, he ran against a person who is probably the best-known politician in America presently, who has been in political life for 30 years, whose own husband was president of the United States for 8 years. And I think most people would say that they were ready to coronate the first female president of the United States, and of course Donald Trump then, in a very decisive victory. We have an electoral college. He defeated Hillary Clinton. So the way that he painted her during the election, the opponent that she was, is also an important, I think, commentary to make. The last two things I would talk about, of course, is the context, the larger context. And I think the world is swinging. The pendulum is swinging away from a kind of leftist orientation back to the center and maybe to the right. It's swinging away from international organizations and multilateralism back towards the nation state. And it's swinging in the direction of what we call Brexit in the UK, where I live. And of course, this is controversial in the EU, but it's something that may be happening in other European countries as well. Donald Trump is part of that phenomenon. You have to think of it in that global context. And then there are a number of policies, of course, that Donald Trump identified himself with. So in any election, people are always interested in what you're going to do. Whether that has to do with trade, which of course was a large part of his candidacy, whether it has to do with the question of terrorism and how we combat terrorism, which people we leave into the United States, which countries we do business with, and then, of course, this critical question of immigration, which has been front and center, frankly, and everywhere around the world, but in the United States, where we have upwards of 12, 13 million illegal immigrants in the United States. So the question of securing our southern border, and I think next week you'll see the contract to begin to build the rest of the wall on the Mexican border. So if you think about these policies, they're also synonymous with who Donald Trump is, what he's planning to do. And I think that in terms of a legacy, if we're thinking about what Trump will accomplish, I think the best way to explain Donald Trump is as a builder. You know, he owned a building real estate company. He built that up from scratch. Of course, his father gave him the initial capital to do it. He has built lots of things around the world. He's a doer. He's a person who wants to achieve things. So unlike politician, political life, he's actually more interested in the infrastructure and the building of the American economy. And I think you're going to see economic growth coming back to 3 or 4%. You're going to see a lowering of the taxes to a level, frankly, they've never been at. You're going to see an infrastructure plan which brings $1 trillion worth of new building into the American economy. These are very significant things, and I think they will change the American landscape for generations and generations to come. So I'm very interested to interact with you and to maybe have some questions from the audience.
Oh yeah, of course, we will have. And let me start with the first question. You mentioned that the best way to understand Donald Trump is to have a look on his business. You have worked with the UN and has dealt with a lot of nations and countries and governments. Is it possible to manage a country like a company?
It's a good question. And there are some similarities and some differences. The similarities, of course, have to do with sticking to a budget, which politicians are not likely to do. They're always overrunning. It also has to do with spending other people's money, which politicians are usually not good at doing because they'll just raise the taxes. In this case, we have a politician who's not a politician. So he's going to run a country with very strict business principles. He's already said that for every new regulation that is enacted, he's going to get rid of 2 other regulations. Now, I've never met a person anywhere in the world, let alone in America, probably in Europe as well, who doesn't want to get rid of some regulations, who thinks that there's too much burden, in other words, on doing business. So I think you're going to find a very different style. It's not going to be business as usual. It's not going to be government as usual.
Thanks, Ted. Having a look on Europe. So I remember a BBC interview. It was a nice breakfast situation. So, and then you said you have worked with the United Nations and have helped to break down the Soviet Union. And now the Euro, there may be another union which needs some kind of taming.
Yes.
What do you mean by taming? Do you want to destroy the EU, or what do you want?
Well, in the first instance, of course, the United States is not a member of the European Union. Not every country in Europe is a member of the European Union. I live in a country that has just decided by majority vote to leave the European Union. I am quite aware that there are other elections this year where similar kinds of forces will be at play, and elections might lead in another direction for some of those countries. I was in my youth, so I'm still a young person. No, I was in my youth part of the State Department and then part of the United Nations when the Berlin Wall came down when the Eastern Bloc collapsed, and then finally when the Soviet Union itself fell of its own dead weight. I would like to say that I was part of the team that had something to do with that, but largely it happened on its own accord. It fell of its own dead weight. I'm suggesting that the American, and I think I'm fair in saying that Trump has a similar view, that the American perspective on Europe is one of great affection for the transatlantic alliance, which of course has, in its different formulations, primarily in NATO, stood the test of time over 70 years. But there is a sense in which certain political machinations, including the European Union, have put the, as I say, the cart before the horse. They have tried to bring about a degree of political integration that not every European person or every European citizen wants. So Donald Trump has said that he does not believe in supranational organizations. America would never join a supranational organization. We believe in some degree of multilateral organization, like the United Nations, although he has sharp criticisms of how the UN is organized as well. And we will prefer, I underline prefer in the future, to deal bilaterally with different countries. That will mean that we will have strong bilateral trade agreements in the future, but not multilateral trade agreements. So the very first thing that Trump did when he was elected in executive orders was to remove America from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I'm suggesting, I think this is a very fair prediction, we will also remove ourselves from the European equivalent, the TTIP negotiation, which has gone on for some years. That probably is also going to die.
Okay, so that's meant by taming.
Yes.
Some understood that as destroying, and there's some fear also among members of the EU Parliament.
Yes.
And as I said, you are the kind of potential candidate for the ambassador, US ambassador at the EU in Brussels. Unfortunately, we have Arne with us, who is a member of the EU Parliament. And I heard some rumor that there are EU Parliament members who would like to reject you. I don't know, is that possible? So if he is chosen by Trump as a US ambassador, can the EU Parliament reject that, or what is the opportunity?
Sure we can. Try. We can try.
And
but
we can also send your ambassador home.
Just let me finish, please. I love America because I've found many friends in America. So you shouldn't call me an America skeptic. But talking about politics, what are we afraid of? We're a strong partner. Europe has 500 million inhabitants. As far as I know, America is around 300 million. Is that right?
Well, if you take our North American Free Trade Agreement, we're actually larger than the European Union.
Okay. Anyway, I think that the Europeans have one problem in weakening themselves. That's what is happening now with Brexit. And Brexit, of course, has shown that not even being running, because it's not opened yet, yeah. Already the first bank is leaving London, going to Frankfurt. So things will happen which we and many of the Brexit supporters did not calculate. And I think this is the problem, speaking about Donald Trump, I would say President Trump, that we don't know enough about him. I myself went to the European Parliament from the family party. And I think there is a lot of people who are frightened because we have a person on the other side who knows economic, but we don't know how he is on social business. Yeah? What will happen if he only has the economic glasses on? Yeah? Is he able to also